Hi everybody! Okay, so for those of you who don't recognize my face, I am Brenna. Hello, what's up? How's it going? I will be talking about my most favorite writer of all time. It is Sylvia Plath, and I will be talking about her one and only novel that she ever published called The Bell Jar. So I feel the need to tell you at least a little bit about Sylvia Plath because this novel is essentially an autobiography. It's technically classified as fiction, but it is roman écrit. It translates to novel with a key, which means that the novel has characters and settings and plot lines that happen in real life, but are veiled with fake names and occasionally fake locations as well. So Sylvia Plath, she was born in 1932. In Massachusetts, just outside of Boston, and she was primarily raised by her mother because her father died when she was very young, and she grew up very academically inclined, and especially with her skill in writing, and so she wanted to be a poet, and she worked really, really hard. She had a lot of failures along the way, but by the early 1960s, late 1950s, she had made a name for herself. And in 1956, she married Ted Hughes, who was also a famous poet, and they were together until 1962. They had 2 children, and about 6 months later, which was also about 3 or 4 weeks after The Bell Jar was published, Sylvia Plath committed suicide, and that's where her story ends, but that's not where the story of The Bell Jar ends. So she had completed writing it, and like I said, she'd already published it, but it didn't gain fame for a little while. Actually very poorly received at first, much to her dismay, and even after she had died, there was still a lot of debate about whether this book was worth reading and worth making famous or not, because it was so unpolished. And it was unlike anything that had been done before. So on to the book itself. Although Sylvia is technically the main character, the fictionalized version is Esther Greenwood, and we open up with her being in New York. She's from Massachusetts, just like Sylvia was, and she got an opportunity to be a writer for a magazine, which, as somebody who grew up wanting to be famous for things she put on paper, it's a perfect opportunity. But we quickly find out that it is not going the way she thought it would. She hates New York, for one, while she loves being showered with all of the gifts that she is given by the magazine company and by their sponsors. She feels extremely lonely and can't stop obsessing over the news of 2 individuals, the Rosenbergs, and they were publicly electrocuted, and that she can't stop obsessing over it because to her that is just the worst possible way to die. For all of your nerve endings to burn, she says it must be the worst thing in the world. So tuck that into your back pocket because we will be bringing that up later. The book follows her as she tries to navigate becoming an adult. So this novel, in a way, is not only roman écrit, but is also Bildungsroman, in that she is trying to navigate how to exit the teenage stage of her life and become a fully functioning adult in society. She battles between domesticity and living a career-driven life. If she could have it her way, she would have both. But this is the 1960s, and that is not something that's entirely possible for her. And so she starts out with having this boyfriend, and his name is Buddy Willard, and he fits the bill for the poster boy of society. He is a doctor in training. He is simple, to the point. He's fairly charismatic, cares for Sylvia, cares for Esther quite a bit, and so they become engaged. But there's a few things off about the relationship. For one, he is so plain that he just doesn't even get poetry. And for Esther, that is a crucial part of her life. She wants to be a poet. And so for him to call poetry dust, which he does, she does not take that lightly. And then later she finds out that he is, in fact, not a virgin like her, but is very much so experienced. And just like her obsession over death and electrocution, she's also obsessed with the idea of losing her virginity. And she wanted to do it with somebody who was in the same position as her. And so she realizes that that's not possible, and she leaves him. On her last night in New York, she is set up on a blind date with a man named Marco, and this guy is about as sleazy as you can get. He actually attempts and gets very near to raping her, but she's able to get away. So she leaves New York, her internship is done. She returns to her hometown in Boston, where she applies for a job that she wants very dearly, and it does not work out. So that, combined with all of these other heavy emotions that she's dealing with, leave Esther severely depressed. And it's to the point where she stops eating and even bathing, and so her mother is extremely concerned. At this point, Esther's father had died. She died when she was 9 years old. And she specifically says in the novel, I had suddenly realized that I hadn't truly felt happiness since I was 9. And similar to Sylvia's life, the death of her father, the death of such an important male figure in her life, severely affected her. And so she's suddenly realized that she's never been happy, right? Ever since she was a kid. And she can't stop thinking about it. And so her mother, who is severely concerned for her, tries to do what she thinks is best. And she takes her to a mental hospital where she receives electroshock therapy. And that does not work. Esther attempts suicide, which lands her in a mental hospital again, where the story really starts to take a turn for the worst. A writer who, for whatever reason, seems to really like Esther and is very well off, pays for her to stay in a really nice mental hospital. And so she's receiving more therapy than just electroshocks, although that's still a part of the routine. She is in this place. She is allowed to go out on the town once or twice a week. With restrictions, and so she has to buddy up, and she buddies up with a lady named Joan, who is a fellow patient. Doesn't entirely like Joan, she more tolerates Joan. Throughout the whole novel, we don't really see Esther connect with anybody. That's another important part of this, is that it is through first-person point of view, and truly, there's no other way to do this novel. To be able to see why she could never connect and see why she didn't want to live, but then changed her mind and decided she did want to live, only to go back and forth again because she feels trapped by the bell jar, hence the name. It's extremely important that we see it through the I, me, my point of view. So anyway, we have Joan, and then another character comes in, and his name is Erwin. He is a math professor at a local college, and he becomes the man who breaks her virginity. As she's lying there in his bed, she begins bleeding, and she flashes back to stories about other people saying the same thing happening, and she smiles because she feels like she is part of a tradition. And this is especially important because this is a sign that she is becoming an adult. So even though her engagement and future marriage didn't work out with Buddy, she at the very least is no longer quote unquote innocent. And this also sort of fails. She ends up in the hospital for a while because she hemorrhaged very severely after having sex with Erwin. And by the time she gets back to the mental hospital, she finds out that Joan has committed suicide. And this is towards the end of the novel. The second to last scene is of her at Joan's funeral, where she looks out to the graveyard. She recalls something that her mom said. Once her doctor's name is Nolan, told her that she would be having an exit interview soon, her mom said, "Finally, we can just pretend all of this was a bad dream." And she reflects on that and says, "To the person in the bell jar, blank and stopped as a dead baby, the world itself is the bad dream. A bad dream. I remembered everything. I remembered the cadavers, and Doreen, and the story of the fig tree, and Marco's diamond, and the sailor on the common, and Dr. Gordon's wall-eyed nurse, and the broken thermometers, and the Negro with his 2 kinds of beans, and the 20 pounds I gained on insulin, and the rock that bulged between the sky and the sea like a gray skull. Maybe forgetfulness, like a kind snow, should numb and cover them. But they were a part of me. They were my landscape." I wish I could just sit here and read you all 240 pages, because everything that I've said up to this point doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of how incredibly penetrating Sylvia Plath's words are to the soul. They're just talking about it now. I literally have chills sitting here looking at a computer screen, because she so clearly felt depression, and she so eloquently displayed it through Esther's point of view. It's really just hard to articulate. But so aside from that, I mean, you can be an emotional writer, and that's great, but you also need to be a smart writer, and you need to know what you're doing. And a lot of people let the confessional style of her work disguise the amount of craft she had in this novel when it first came out. Like I said, it was poorly received. A lot of people felt that its tone and just overall as a novel, it was unpolished. And that was her exact intent. She poured her heart into this, but she did it in the most brilliant way. I had to write down everything that she used because I knew I would get caught up in the emotion side of it. But so in terms of her craft, she uses imagery so much throughout the whole thing. So the scene that I just read to you, where she is talking about snow as something that numbs bad memories, that numbs the things that make her depressed. She uses that a few times, to the point where she even, after that, describes all the nurses as wearing snow caps, as wearing snow white uniforms. And so that clearly shows us that she views her doctors and just the medicinal world in general as something that numbs the pain, that numbs what makes her as an individual. And she uses blood quite a few times. She uses mirrors. As I said earlier, she treats herself so poorly that she becomes unrecognizable. In the section I just read, she mentions gaining 20 pounds. She goes back and forth, and throughout the whole thing, she she looks at her reflection every now and then, and by the middle of it, she doesn't even recognize herself. I mentioned the fig tree in that section as well. And so the fig tree is mentioned about halfway through the novel, and it represents the multitudes that life can have. And so each fig represents a life choice. One fig represents marrying Buddy Willard. One fig represents having sex with Irwin. One represents becoming a famous poet. One represents dying by suicide. And she stands there in this lucid imagination type of scene, and she cannot pick any of the figs because she can't decide what to do. And so all the figs rot and fall off the tree and hit the ground, and they're dead. They're gone. So she remembers the fig tree by the end of it. Aside of these symbols that show up consistently exactly when they should throughout the entire piece, we also have her incredible, eloquent sentence structure. So the section that I read you is from, like I said, near the end in chapter 20, and it's separated by all of these different paragraphs, but the way that she's designed the tone, it reads so fast. It reads as if your mind is in a frenzy, because that's exactly what Sylvia wants us to do. She wants us to feel as if we are Esther. And she achieves that, I think, very well. So I had mentioned that she has a suicide attempt. She tried a few different avenues, but chickened out of every single one, for lack of a better phrase, and really to use her own language. But there is a part, and this is something that many people have had tattooed on them, actually. So she is out at the beach with her friends, and at this point she's decided she's going to kill herself. And she's back home in Boston, and she's with these friends, but in the way that many of us have felt, she's still so alone. So she's standing at the ocean, and nobody wants to go in with her because it's freezing. So she says, I started to walk toward the water. Somehow, in the broad, shadowless night of noon, the water looked amiable and welcoming. I thought drowning must be the kindest way to die, and burning the worst. Remember the electrocution that she was afraid of, and, after this, we see her go through electroshock therapy, and so everything comes full circle in this novel in an incredible way. Some of those babies in the jars that Buddy Willard showed me had gills, he said. They went through a stage where they were just like fish. A little rubbishy wavelet, full of candy wrappers and orange peel and seaweed, folded over my foot. I heard the sand thud behind me, and Cal came up. Let's swim to that rock out there, I pointed at it. Are you crazy? That's a mile out. What are you? I said. Chicken? Cal took me by the elbow and jostled me into the water. When we were waist high, he pushed me under. I surfaced, splashing, my eyes seared with salt. Underneath, the water was green and semi-opaque as a hunk of quartz. I started to swim, a modified dog paddle, keeping my face toward the rock. Cal did a slow crawl. After a while, he put his head up and treaded water. Can't make it, he was panting heavily. Okay, you go back. I thought I would swim out until I was too tired to swim back. As I paddled on, my heart boomed like a dull motor in my ears. I am. Something else that Sylvia is able to do is she takes us so deep into Esther's mindset and so deep into her consciousness, and then is able to pull us right back out. So the next sentence after that incredible scene is, that morning I had tried to hang myself. I had taken the silk cord of my mother's yellow bathrobe as soon as she left for work, and the amber shade. And then she goes on to describe another failed suicide attempt. And so her pacing in this novel is just incredible. And it allows us to delve in, and it allows us to feel interrupted. all exactly when it should be. The last sentence in this whole thing is, "The eyes and the faces all turned themselves toward me, and guiding myself by them, as by a magical thread, I stepped into the room." And this room is where her exit interview will be. She's still so young, and she still so clearly has a life ahead of her. And I debated telling you the end of this, but the thing is, because this is such an autobiographical piece, we know that this bell jar, the thing that traps her and keeps her depressed, could fall at any point. We know that the bell jar does in fact fall back down on her, because this isn't about Esther Greenwood. This is about a real woman who lived and had so many severe problems and was never properly helped. Nothing about this ending is the important part of the bell jar. The middle is what's most important. And through her craft and her imagery and her motifs, Sylvia is able to build an incredible narrative that you can't put down. It forces you to feel pain. It forces you to root for Esther and to understand Esther. And it does this in a way that anybody who has dealt with depression feels complete solace in, because if you've had depression, you will relate to this book more than so many out there. And on the flip side too, if you find yourself unable to understand depression and understand how it transforms the mind and how the mind views things and comprehends them, this book, unlike most, will help you understand. And it's just incredible, and it makes me wish so dearly that Sylvia was still around in order to say thank you, because no piece of fiction that I've ever come across matches it. So Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar. It will make you so sad, but it is the best and most beautiful possible way to do so. Alright, that is it. Thank you for bearing with me. This video will probably end up being twice as long as it should be, so I apologize if that's the case. I really hope you enjoyed hearing about the bell jar and Sylvia. I certainly love it, so getting to share my love for it is really exciting. Okay, that's all I have. Bye, guys.